So now it's time to welcome our guest, and our guest speaker is Professor Yasir Suleiman, CBE, FRSE. He holds the post of His Majesty Sultan Qaboos bin Said, Professorship of Modern Arabic Studies, and Director of the Alwaleed Centre for Islamic Studies in Cambridge. And he has moved to Cambridge from Edinburgh, so he's well known in Edinburgh and knows Edinburgh very well. And he's going to be speaking, he's going to give a lecture on the Arab Spring, something which is absolutely current and extremely important at this present time, and is in fact changing all the time. And one of the themes he's going to be talking about are these changes. And the title is Tropes and Discourses. And tropes, he will explain what that is, but these are essentially metaphors, and it's the use of language and the interpretation of language and the heritage of language and the meaning of that to society and changes in society. And he's very much going to be talking about the rapid changes in society that are taking place across the Middle East, not just in one country, but in several countries. So I think we will be absolutely thrilled by what he has to say. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Sir John, for your introduction and for the invitation to speak here at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It's certainly a great pleasure for me to be back here in Cambridge. It shows you that in my mind I haven't actually traveled. I'm still in Edinburgh, so and I think I'm back in Cambridge. I'm back, but to be back in Edinburgh, which is actually, when I'm asked to define home, it is partly home for us. It's home with Jerusalem for me, and we come back from time to time. When we moved, we decided to buy a flat so that we can always come back to Edinburgh and enjoy Edinburgh. I found myself becoming more and more Scottish the longer I live in England. So now, I want to thank Una for organizing this, and also to thank you for coming. There are lots of friends here, and that carries responsibility. It gives me a platform, perhaps, to disgrace myself really in big time, but I hope that I'll be able to say something which will help explain something about the Arab Spring. I have a written lecture which I'd like to go through. I'll try to read it slowly because I'm having an argument that I'd like to put forward, and I want to put it forward as accurately as I can. Since I'm going to have some less than complimentary things to say about economic explanations of the Arab Spring, I feel I should start by praising an economist. John Maynard Keynes, an illustrious past member of my college at Cambridge, was a notoriously famous smart man. Smart enough, in fact, to know the limits of the science of predictive modeling. Some 18 years before the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe, he said about the prospects of a European war, the price of copper 20 years hence, we simply do not know. There was, he argued, no scientific basis on which to calculate any kind of probability, particularly in the social sciences or sciences and humanities. Another economist, John Kay, commented on this recently in the column in the Financial Times. He said most predictive models, he noted, deal with uncertainty by extrapolating from the past. As a result, they reveal nothing so much as the limitations of the imagination of the person who constructed them. Even worse, models can end up depriving analysts of the agency that is rightfully there. Models can become so authoritative that analysts are expected to rework their inputs to ensure that the model gives them the right answer and neither is discredited. I'm not offering a predictive model today, but I hope I am not avoiding generalizations to shield myself from criticism. Recent events in the Middle East have shown that, unlike the analyst trapped by his model, ordinary Arabs do not lack agency or imagination or indeed courage. In fact, because they have shown these qualities, many of the dominant models governing our knowledge of the Middle East are currently being questioned, even dismantled, as quickly as the regimes whose longevity they assumed. As our models of Middle Eastern politics are being rethought, scholars, policymakers, and intelligence analysts are asking themselves, why did we fail to predict it? How did the Arab Spring emerge out of the void, the notorious democracy deficit of the region? Yet these events, which are still unfolding, did not emerge out of a void. In Tunisia and Egypt, there were several strikes before the onset of the Arab Spring. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood and a liberal party called Kifaya, which translates as enough in English, had led repeated small-scale protests against the Mubarak regime. They demanded an end to dynastic rule, an end to state corruption in politics, in the economy, and the administration of justice. They pressed for an end to the constant violations of human rights and to restrictions on freedom of expression and assembly. In Jordan, the Islamists opposed, in small-scale demonstrations, state corruption, the warm government policy towards Israel, and the constant manipulation of the electoral system to deny them their fair share of the votes. Before the onset of the Arab Spring, Jordanian teachers had mounted many campaigns to establish a professional association or a trade union. This was granted only after intense action in Jordan following the popular uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt. I doubt if this trade union would have been allowed without the pressure generated by the Arab Spring. This picture is repeated with local variations in other Arab countries. I refer to these events to counter a prevalent motif in discussions of the Arab Spring. Yes, no one could have predicted the speed and the intensity with which the first wave of Arab Spring uprisings unfolded in Egypt and Tunisia and Egypt, or how quickly these uprisings spread to other countries. But this does not mean that the Arab Spring came out of a vacuum. Why then did the mighty CIA, MI6, Israeli Mossad, and other intelligence agencies in the region and beyond fail to see it coming? The reason, I think, is simply complacency. These agencies grew accustomed to their belief that ordinary people in the Arab world lacked agency, that the Arabs' dream of democracy was more rhetorical than real, that cultural expressions of discontent are not really political, but at most just a form of letting off steam, and that the coercive instruments of state security have, time after time, proven their resilience and ability to deal effectively and brutally with any challenge to the authority of the ruling elite. Because of this frame of mind, foreign intelligence agencies ignored grassroots feelings, treating them as idle chat. And because of this, these agencies continued to concentrate on the usual targets, the armed forces and the security apparatus for their loyalty or otherwise to the state, trade unions and student organizations for Islamist infiltration, NGOs as the conduits for political activity, political parties if they existed, prominent figures in government and society at large, and most important of all, Islamist movements as the most likely source for any serious challenge to the established order. Ordinary people were discounted because, in effect, they were thought to lack agency or the stamina to bring about fundamental change in society. The youth, in particular, were considered a lost generation, more interested in internet communication and computer gadgetry than real politics. Chat and its networks were considered the domain of the virtual and the cyber rather than the real. And all of this stemmed from a fundamentally flawed idea that the Arab world was prone to autocracy as a character trait, that it is antithetical to democratic rule, treating the calls for this kind of rule as no more than rhetorically declared aspirations. Israel's description of itself as the only democracy in the Middle East, as an oasis of rationality in a jungle-like neighborhood, sums this attitude well. Many in the West accepted this as an established dogma. But in spite of all of this, the Arab Spring has acted and seems set to act as a catalyst for real change in the Arab world. Understandably, the world has high expectations of these events, as the Arabs themselves do. But it is too early to speak of enduring change in any one direction. Much to the dismay of those in the modeling business, volatility rather than stability will most probably be the shape of things to come. This means that success in the future will depend on how well people in the Arab world and elsewhere can tolerate and harness variability and volatility. It will depend on how far they can resist the temptation to impose a top-down coercive stability that short-circuits the normal course of political change under the banner of fighting anarchy. The same rule will apply to analysts too. A linear notion of cause and effect in understanding the Arab Spring reduces what are complex phenomena to an emaciated, almost skeletal structure. As Keynes knew all too well, this creates a false sense of cognitive understanding and control that is intolerant of ambiguity. With these caveats, let me highlight what I think are some of the most important features of the emerging political terrain in the Arab Middle East. I'll be talking about these 9 themes. Starting with the top one, a fearless attack on fear. Over the past few months, I have attended many talks on the Arab Spring, including at my own university in guest lectures that I have personally organized. I have been consistently struck by how the words freedom, dignity, and justice are never, yes, never invoked in these discussions. This is in stark contrast to the way the Arab Spring is narrated by the Arabs. Trade and the economy are not the first things that the Egyptians, Tunisians, and others mention when they talk about the Arab Spring. The frontline concepts that one usually hears are Izza wa Karama, dignity, Hurriya, freedom, and Adala, justice. The Arab Spring is an attack on fear and a call for freedom, freedom of association, of organization, of political participation, and of speech. We see this in the names of some of the Egyptian political parties, especially those of an Islamist orientation. The Muslim Brotherhood established a new party in Egypt, and they called it the Freedom and Justice Party, Hizb al-Hurriya wal-Adala. No doubt because they know the deep resonance freedom and justice have in Egyptian society. This also trades on the name of the Islamist Justice Party in Turkey, which is held by some as a model in the Islamist political arena. One Salafist party in Egypt is called Nur, light. This name has strong Quranic associations, but it also suggests that Egypt is emerging or needs to emerge out of darkness into a new dawn as a result of the uprising. Another Salafist party is called Asala, authenticity. This name suggests that what Egypt needs is a return to its Islamic roots and past. 2 Islamist parties go by the name Reform and Development Party and Reform and Revival Party. Actually, the word translated as reform, Islah in Arabic, means restoring a condition of rightness and healthiness, getting society in a fit and proper state again. The Sufi Islamist party is called the Egyptian Liberation Party, suggesting that Egypt needs to be liberated. In the past, the word liberation in the name of a party alluded to the colonialist context, or in the Palestinian case, liberation from Israeli occupation. Although it is not clear what Egypt needs to be liberated from, the name of this party reflects the value-laden belief that Egypt is not yet fully free. The Nasserist party, a pan-Arabist party, is called Hizb al-Karama, the party of dignity, a name that resonates with the yearning for this human value among the Egyptians. One of the centrist parties in Egypt is called Al-Ghad, tomorrow, which in Arabic carries the meaning of hope and a bright new day. A bright economic future is part of this terminological aspiration, but I doubt if it could ever top freedom, dignity, and justice in order of popular priority. The names of these parties, whether Islamist, pan-nationalist, or liberal leanings, suggest that values are important marketing tools. This is not to imply that they are just slogans, as the cynics might want to argue. They are effective political marketing tools because they resonate with the Egyptian public, with its aspirations, and the ways in which it seeks to imagine and define the public good. In fact, claims about the public good have never been absent from Arab societies, even under authoritarian rule. A visitor from my beloved Scotland to Syria or Egypt at any time over the last decade would not have had to wait long before hearing the claim, "Fi aman hun," there is safety and security here. In other words, we might not have everything you have in the West, but there is a level of social stability. The streets are safe to walk at night. Interestingly, this is the first claim that is thrown back in the faces of the regime by this man here. This man, his placard reads, "Where is the security and safety of Egyptian streets, Minister of Interior?" I took this picture of a lonely man raising a double-sided placard in Talat Harb Square, a few hundred meters away from Tahrir Square in Cairo on 17th November 2011. The placard addresses the Chief of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. It moves from the indignant reference to security and safety to other value-laden words, such as freedom and justice. It refers to the Egyptians as the people of the Nile whose blood is not cheap. Value-laden words such as these had pride of place in the publicity materials of the candidates for the Egyptian parliamentary elections starting on 28th November 2011, at the beginning of this week. This was in addition to the reference to the safety and security, amn wa aman, of the ordinary people, the second and third word, of the ordinary people against thugs and the coercive power of the police. Income levels, standard of living, unemployment, and so on are not mentioned as front-line lexical items in local narrations of the Arab Spring. The words that are most readily used refer to human values that are universal in character. To understand the Arab Spring, therefore, we need to inject this value-oriented perspective in narrating it, sticking to materialist explanations that invoke economics and employment as primary or sole factors, as often happens in Western academic discourses on the topic, will not do justice to what is happening. This is the second side. This side of the placard, the second side of the placard, talks about freedom and its high price. The first word, al-hurriya, thamanha ghali. Freedom has a high price. Interestingly, freedom is not portrayed on this placard as a Western value or as a result of the European Enlightenment that can be grafted onto Arab or Egyptian political culture only awkwardly and imperfectly. Nor is it seen as a gift to be offered by liberators coming from the outside. The expression on the placard suggests that it is something to be achieved internally through a process of self-mastery. Only then can it be highly valued. This side of the placard reads, "The price of freedom is extremely high, Tantawi." This is the chief of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. "You won't know its value because you are a slave to your own desires." Freedom, unquote. Freedom is here a moral achievement, one by overcoming the forces that keep a person or a people bound. The question arises then, why are value-laden concepts avoided in academic explanations of the Arab Spring that I have come across in lectures that I have organized personally and in lectures elsewhere outside Cambridge that I have attended? Is it because values are believed to be proxies for other fundamental causes of this spring that are ultimately related to hard and quantifiable units of economic analysis? Could it be that the standards of evaluation and validation we apply in academic discourse militate against the use of soft categories of analysis such as dignity, freedom, and justice in explaining socio-political phenomena? If so, what are the losses, if any, we may incur by ignoring value-laden terms when explaining phenomena of this type? How can we translate local narratives of the Arab Spring to those one finds in Western studies of this phenomenon? In other words, what conceptual exchange mechanism can we apply to convert the soft and nebulous into the hard and quantifiable in talking about the Arab Spring? These are fundamental questions that strike at the heart of how we study and conceptualize the Middle East. Although I have some answers to the basic premises that underline the set of questions that I have just talked about, I will not attempt to outline these answers here, as that this would require a separate lecture. But let me venture this remark. Ignoring native narratives in academic discourses of the Arab Spring is formally similar to ignoring the ordinary people by the CIA, the MI6, and the Mossad in monitoring the political in the days preceding the Arab Spring. Complacency and outmoded ways of thinking are responsible in both cases. If our categories of analysis cannot accommodate nativist narratives, the answer cannot be to ignore these narratives, but to re-examine the ways in which we think and rethink our academic subjects, our analytical tools, and the standards of validation we apply in evaluating our research findings. Ordinary people have agency. The Arab Spring is not just an assertion of universal moral values. It's also, as a courageous, discursive act in an authoritarian climate, an affirmation of agency. Such an affirmation of individual and collective agency has itself encouraged people to act. Agency here is opposed not to fatalism, as in traditional Orientalist accounts, but to fear. The Arab Spring is, if nothing else, an attack on the political modality of fear. This attack has itself struck fear into the hearts of the rulers and the political elite who had arrogantly grown accustomed to the idea that agency rested with them and them alone. Whereas the norm in the Arab world was, and to some extent still is, for fear to operate top-down, from regime or state to people, a new situation is emerging where fear has started to operate bottom-up, from people to regime or state. If sustained, this shift in the vector of fear will have the capacity to transform the individual at the cognitive, emotional, and political level from subject to citizen. The Arab Spring may therefore mark the birth of the Arab citizen in a way which I think may or could or would warrant calling the Arab uprisings emancipation movements. They're not just freedom movements, they're emancipation movements. The revolutionary potential of the Arab Spring lies in the continuity of this emerging emancipatory horizons and in its embeddedness in the public sphere socially and politically. The fact that the Arabs are paying with their blood in the fight against tyranny suggests that the fight is not driven by economics, trade, or employment, but by the basic desire for dignity, freedom, justice, which are the hallmarks of the citizen and not the subject. The fact that the Arab Spring uprisings in such countries as Tunisia and Egypt did not stop at the level of removing the head of the regime, but are drilling down to the deeper levels of the political order, suggests an awareness of the power of agency that the Arabs have acquired, and a readiness to exercise it. I expect this to be the case in Yemen and in Syria if the latter goes in the direction of Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. The Arabs have a saying, I read it out first in Arabic, حط راسك بين هالروس وقول لقطاع الروس, which translates as, don't put your head above the parapet because it will be cut off. This, in a nutshell, is what subjecthood is about: acquiescence out of fear. The fact that the Arabs are daring to put their heads above the parapet repeatedly, despite the fact that these heads are shot at every time they do so in some countries, suggests that the Arabs' yearning to be citizens is not a passing desire. In ordinary conversations and in TV programs about the Arab Spring, some Arabs have used the term ubudiyya, slavery, to describe their situation. I have heard expressions such as "zihna al-ubudiyya," we are fed up being slaves, living in a state of slavery. The implication being that an end must be put to this state of existence. Point 3, Arab states, regimes and rulers are brittle. As the vector of fear has been reversed, so the realization has spread that seemingly impregnable Arab states, regimes and rulers are in fact brittle and vulnerable in the face of peaceful mass action. Peaceful mass protest has proved to be more effective, when possible, than violence in challenging the full brutality of the established orders. This bitterness was foreseen by the late Nazih Ayyubi. His book, Overstating the Arab State, published in 1995, which was written 16 years ago, before the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia, issued a strong health warning to policymakers. Do not accept at face value, he said, the argument that the Arab regimes are here to stay. Like the regimes themselves, Ayyubi implied, that argument had become overstated and dogmatic. And dogmas sooner or later reveal their brittleness when challenged by discourses and actions that have more life in them. If Nazih Ayyubi were here today, he would have been reminding us, perhaps with some modulations in his argument, and the inevitable resigned smile, haven't I told you so? Point 4, charismatic leadership. Discourse, dogma, assertion, affirmation, these are all firmly in the domain of the political. As, of course, are other registers like humor, cynicism, and even silence. The Arab Spring has reminded us that we need to study what visions and possibilities of life these different registers affirm and deny. But we also need to study how cultural registers themselves are given life or left to become hollow and brittle. In Tunisia, and subsequently in other Arab countries, the affirmation of common human dignity was amplified by the sacrifice of real human life. That costly affirmation has opened the way for other cultural expressions, which are revealing and giving force to new visions and possibilities of life. One such cultural register that has been given renewed impetus in Egypt recently is the opinion poll. What visions and possibilities have these revealed? Well, recent polls in Egypt have tended to suggest that for the post of president, the Egyptians want a strong and experienced leader who can gain the respect of his own people, who can take on vested interest, weed out corruption, stand up to the military, dismantle the coercive security institutions of the state, and also assert Egypt's position and interests regionally and internationally. Opinion polls suggest that the person who fits this description best is Amr Moussa, former Secretary General of the Arab League and Egyptian Foreign Minister under Mubarak. An urbane man, Amr Moussa tops all opinion polls for this post, coming way ahead of his rival Muhammad Salim Al-Awwa, who comes with strong Islamic credentials. It's very important for us to remember. Amr Moussa is not an Islamist. He's a liberal and secularist kind of politician. This vision of political leadership chimes with the broader message of the Arab Spring, that neither charismatic leadership nor organized parties or trade unions are an essential element in bringing about drastic political change in society. They are important, but they are not the decisive factor. They can help, of course, in preparing the ground for such change, but diffuse power in multiple locations and with different motivations and trajectories has been shown to work. This is a major difference with the colonial and post-colonial worlds in the Arab Middle East, in which Nasser-like figures were considered essential in national struggles. It is, however, unlikely that the vision of a charismatic leader will continue ad infinitum. Let me move to 5, non-ideological concerns. As they move away from charismatic leadership, the cultural registers of the Arab Spring also reveal a vision of issues-based politics. This is opposed to how we have tended to think about politics in the Middle East, as based around cross-state or state-based ideologies such as pan-Arab nationalism, pan-Islamism, or neoliberalism, and so on. In its place, there seems to be an issues-based politics of demanding political freedoms, constitutional reforms, social justice, equal administration of the law, transparency, and public accountability to fight corruption and nepotism. These issues, of course, are not devoid of ideology, but they act as rallying cries for broad-based coalitions among different actors, and so they can legitimately be called post-ideological when compared with the divisive, party-based politics of the past. It is this character that has given the Arab Spring its appeal and resilience. 6, an Arab or a sphere of Arab affinity. What I have said above does not imply that Arabism as a cultural expression, a structure of feeling, and even a political ideal is dead. Rather, the affirmations of dignity and justice that I mentioned earlier have given it a new form of life. The Arab Spring reveals that cross-state Arab solidarity has started to reconfigure the Arab political landscape. It is true, as we have been told ad nauseum, and every single speaker you listen to says, these are different countries, and they are different countries. But I want to say they're also similar countries, and that's my argument here. It is true, as we have been told ad nauseum, that Egypt is not Tunisia, that Libya is not Egypt or Tunisia, that Bahrain is not Libya, Egypt, or Tunisia, that Yemen is not Bahrain or Libya or Egypt or Tunisia, and that Syria is not Yemen or Libya or Bahrain or Egypt or Tunisia. The rulers remind us of that all the time, and we, in our academic discourse, tend to talk about it and almost ignore the similarities that underlie these differences. But the very fact that these negative comparisons are made by those striving to shore up brutal regimes suggests a shared awareness that these countries have something in common, and that notion itself has political force. The Arab League would not have acted with the resolve it did in dealing with Libya and Syria had it not been for this solidarity. What is the register of Arabism today? It is no longer just a shared genealogy of history, language, and culture. It is also the expression of shared aspirations for future democracy, justice, and the desire to eradicate nepotism and corruption. If anything, the Arab regimes have paradoxically given unity and life to this register, and thus unified Arab peoples through their leadership's brutality and corrupt practices. Whether or not these events should properly be called a spring, there is no doubt that they are distinctively Arab. There were revolutions galore before the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia in 2010, including the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Velvet Revolution in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution in Georgia, but none of these stirred the Egyptians or the Egyptians into action in the way the Tunisian Revolution had moved the Egyptians. The Shia in Bahrain were not stirred to rise in support of their rights by the Iranian Revolution in 1979, or by other mass protest movements such as the Green Revolution in 2009. But they were moved to act by the Tunisian and Egyptian uprisings in almost completely or mostly Sunni countries. If more evidence is needed, we can point to the cadence of slogans that reverberated through the streets of Arab cities, demanding the fall of the regime. Ash-Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam, and some of the poetry that you see in the Arab world, which is common to almost all Arabs. This same slogan, the common currency of all the Arab uprisings, reveals the transferability of emotions in a regionally networked cognitive, linguistic, and affective space. We can also point to the fact that from the Atlantic to the Gulf, Arabic-speaking audiences were and are glued to their television sets, watching and debating the same news stories. I experienced this in March 2011 in Abu Dhabi on the Gulf, and Morocco on the Atlantic, and in Egypt in November 2011. This attests to the existence of a shared Arab public sphere, which also extends to the diaspora. It is therefore important not to conceptualize the Arab Spring at its inception in Islamic terms. It is first and foremost an Arab-inflected spring. There are important country variations and there are Islamic impulses, but it is not an Islamic spring. The participation of non-Muslim communities in the spring demands that we do not impose on it an exclusive Islamic framework to fit it into pre-existing schemata. Otherwise, we will miss the different ways that political actors within and beyond the so-called Islamic front are now contesting the nature and legacy of the uprisings. Middle Eastern specialists need to know this and to focus their analytic gaze accordingly. 7. Arab exceptionalism and shared values. The Arab Spring challenges the stereotype of Arab exceptionalism, which gained enhanced currency after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. At a time of revolutionary change in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, and before that in Iran in 1979-80, the Arab world was a bystander, mesmerized but paralyzed, and enthused but confused. This has changed now in a positive way. The Arab Spring is an indigenous movement and not an importation from the outside. This is an important factor in its success. In spite of all kinds of regime-generated conspiracy theories, the Arab Spring is homegrown, and it has been embedded in an Arab solidarity sphere that has the potential to modulate, even challenge, the transient narratives of Islamists in their various forms, regionally and transregionally. The challenge facing the agents of the Arab Spring is how to transform the spring from a seemingly freak but welcome weather condition, if I may put it this way, into an enduring aspect of the climate of the Arab Middle East, in spite of all weather fluctuations on the political and economic scene. The biggest danger in this regard are impatience and cynicism. Cynicism is extremely corrosive. It eats away at sincerity and rationality in public life with equal measure, leading to disengagement, conspiracy thinking, and nostalgic comparisons with the past, stripped of all of its brutality and corruption. I came across such nostalgic accounts of the Arab Spring during my visit to Cairo in November 2011. In addition, the Arab Spring has pointed to a world of shared values with the West and other regions of the world. No one culture or region has a monopoly on freedom, democracy, justice, and equal opportunity as expressions of universal human aspirations. The West seems to have enjoyed these rights longer than other nations and regions of the world. But it does not own the copyright for these rights. It is important to acknowledge this and to proclaim it unequivocally in all fora and at all times to ensure that entry into a world shaped by these rights is not seen on the Arab side as capitulation or as an extension of the privileges enjoyed by the members of an exclusive club to previously morally challenged nations. This attitude of equality among nations can engender respect and dignity cross-culturally at all levels, especially if backed by meaningful action and support from the West to the post-Arab Spring world. Approached from this perspective, the West will be as challenged as the Arab world in seeking to reap the harvest of these uprisings. 8. Confidence deficit and cognitive turn. Let me return at this point to economic interests and to trust. It is well known that the Arab Middle East is strategically important to global powers because of the latter's economic interests. Western powers have traditionally favored political stability over democracy to protect these interests. In order to secure these assets, they have, as it were, been willing to trade their standard-bearer values of democracy, freedom, and the rule of law for political stability. However, as an economist will tell you, economies do not just need actors and things to exchange. They also need trust. In fact, in trading politically according to the old calculus, Western powers have run up a deficit, a confidence deficit that characterizes the relationship between the West and the Arab world as seen from the Arab side. The West, represented by the US, needs to eliminate this deficit, not through a harsh austerity program, but by underwriting their words with action. Action that advances the values to which the uprisings have laid claim. The study of culture as a political medium can help here. It tells us that the West, symbolized by the US in the Arab imaginary, is seen as its own worst enemy, because it fails to recognize the truly common currency of human values. The old paradigm of words speak louder than actions, or worse still, words speak in place of actions, has given the West a bad image of duplicity and double standards. The West does not just need a policy turn in dealing with the Arab world. More important, it badly needs an infrastructural cognitive turn. A cognitive turn, that is what's needed in its understanding of the Arab Middle East and in the way it thinks and frames its policies towards it. This cognitive turn will prove to be a big soul-searching challenge for the West. It will require unlearning all the bad thinking habits the West has internalized and turned into a constant of its foreign policy in the Arab Middle East. For the West, learning new lessons will need to be accompanied with the unlearning of old ones. This is not an easy task. Unlearning is known to be harder and more challenging than learning, simply because what is to be unlearned may and sometimes does erect a barrier against the penetration of the new learning. Teaching new tricks to an old dog is never easy. At the beginning, cognitive infiltration from an emerging horizon is the best way we can hope for in the new order. This process needs to be managed carefully to bring about a break with the bad old past. The new relationship with the Arab world will need to be based on the principle of actions speak louder than words. The NATO intervention in Libya has, in my opinion, been beneficial in addressing the confidence deficit and as a sign that the West is willing to underwrite its words with actions. Normally, such action would be met with mass demonstrations and popular condemnation in the Arab world. The fact that this did not happen suggests that the West has been seen to have done the right thing on this occasion. Instead, Russia and China have lost a lot of credibility because of their pro-Gaddafi stance. Their credibility has received a further blow because of the political cover and support these two countries have given to Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. As an expression of its readiness to tackle the deficit further, the West, led by the US, will at some point have to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It had better do so sooner rather than later. I think actually personally the time is too late. This conflict has been left to fester for a long time. Resolving it on a just and enduring basis will add to the moral authority of the West, that most important of sovereign credit ratings. And it would remove from the regional sphere an emotionally charged issue that can be exploited by any disaffected party, especially the Islamists. The sense of Palestinian injustice that imbues this conflict resonates throughout the Arab Middle East and will always be a prism through which the good intentions of the West are tested. Contrary to what President Obama seemed to say in his speech on 19 May 2011, anti-Israeli feeling in the Arab world is not created by Arab rulers, the Islamists, or even Iran, but is the result of Israeli occupation policies and the blind American political and economic support for them. 9, the last point. The Islamists, the West's biggest bugbear. Another way to address the confidence deficit is to support the democratic order in the Middle East when and if it emerges. The key issue will be whether and how to engage with democratically elected Islamists. The Islamists are treated as the West's biggest bugbear when it comes to articulating daring new policies towards the emerging political order. Continuing this policy posture towards the Islamists may in fact prove counterproductive. The Islamists will not go away, nor should they. Whenever they surface legitimately, they must be considered as an expression of the popular will, and the popular will must be acknowledged, respected, and if it's thought necessary, openly contested through the force of ideas. A policy of coercively excluding Islamists will give them legitimacy, the opportunity to recruit disaffected segments of the population, and to act in the shadows from a position of ideological purity. That is a luxury that should not be given. It would be wiser to allow them, in fact to require them, to take part in the political process in the full light of day. This form of participation may prove challenging to the Islamists, for whom transparency until now is not a tool of their political trade. Political participation will expose the distance between ideological posture and practical solutions to questions such as employment, labor rights, economic growth, the provision of services, and the inevitable compromises of regional and international relations. These challenges may prove positive. Experience shows that when embedded in the political process, Islamists can turn into pragmatists who cut deals across ideological lines in ways that would not be entertained when they are excluded. The Islamists also know that anti-Western policies can be self-harming if they cause aid and foreign investment to be stopped in a way that threatens their position locally. The success of the Islamists in Turkey has also offered the Muslim constituencies in the Arab world an alternative model to violent extremism. In fact, events on the ground may render Islamism itself an overly blunt and broad category, as the requirements of deal-making and coalition building blur the borders of ideological purity. Already, Islamism covers a multitude of opposed political visions and interests. The Muslim Brotherhood opposes Al-Qaeda and the Salafis, and has little tolerance for Shia-inspired Islamic parties or movements, such as Hezbollah or Lebanon, or the Shia in Bahrain. These feelings of antipathy, distrust, and open hostility sometimes are reciprocated in equal measure by other Islamist groups. For some Islamists are those who may at any moment revert to type and exploit the electoral process irreversibly to their advantage. These fears are summed up in the expression, one man, one vote, one time. One solution is to build a system of government based on proportional representation rather than majoritarian rule. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces has proposed this formula for Egypt. Will they succeed? I don't know. But also experience not far from here shows that an attempt to try to prevent a particular party from emerging as the majority party don't always work. We do not yet know how Islamists of different types will position themselves on these issues, nor do we know how much support they are likely to command, or what kinds of Islamism will prevail. If Keynes were around to advise on the calculus of political probabilities, he would doubtless say that it cannot be done. Any attempt to envisage different scenarios would reveal only the limits of our imagination. We are painfully aware of our own limitations in the wake of an event that asks us to make a cognitive turn in our understanding of what Arabs aspire to and expect, and what kind of political agency they can wield. And so we are left with uncertainty, excitement, volatility, and hope. Even as the Arab Spring continues to unfold, it has taught us that we need to take cultural expressions seriously as an agent and medium of political change. As scholars, we need to take the Arab Spring seriously as a location of broadly human aspirations. Western governments and policymakers need to continue to address the damaging confidence deficit that the old political calculus had built up. For all of us, but especially for Western and US thinking, this will require a cognitive turn in the ways we think about the Middle East. The cognitive turn involves recognizing that when the West acts in accordance with its declared values of freedom and democracy, as it has done in Libya, it gains respect, or at least it avoids the blame if the blame it rightly or wrongly usually receives. But when the US continues to support Israeli occupation, that credibility is at risk. This is a historic moment. Will the US and its allies in the Western world make a full cognitive turn, or will they perform a few cognitive twists? I'm not sure, but I'm not hopeful. The Arab Middle East has also a responsibility to protect and nurture its hard-won freedoms wherever these have been secured. The Arabs need to do this not because it matters to the West to do so, but because, as the man with the placard declared, the price of freedom is known only to those who know the value of their own blood. Thank you.
Well, I think the first thing we should do is to thank Yasir for that really fascinating analysis of a complex uprising, almost a revolution across the whole of the Arab world, which he explained in terms which I found extremely helpful and extremely interesting, because it brings together, I think what he was saying was inbuilt values which didn't just suddenly appear, but were part of the civilized view of these different Arab countries. What actually triggered that, I think we should perhaps probe him on a little further, because it is a truly remarkable phenomenon that this has happened so quickly, is still happening, and we're not quite certain yet as to what is going to come from it. And then you have the relationships between the different countries in the Arab world. Are these very similar? Are these identical, almost uprisings, changes, or are they intrinsically different? And then what about the relations with the rest of the world, particularly with the West, and indeed changing views in the relationship between the Arab countries and China and Russia? These international dimensions are hugely significant. And then we have the question of what happens next. Will we get stability? What kind of political outcomes are you going to have? Is the inherent fear in some minds of the predominance of possible Islamist politicians a real problem? These are all part of a mix. They're part of what is effectively a boiling cauldron. And we're not quite sure what's going to happen to this cauldron. So I don't think we have any problem in a series of questions to Yasir. So thank you very much for that amazing lecture.
Thank you. Could I say just one point quickly?
Yes.
I would be very happy to receive questions on individual countries and on events taking place in different countries. I've tried to get away from that because practically every single talk I've been to has been event-driven, and I really wanted not to be event-driven, but to look at patterns perhaps and a few things that are emerging behind the scenes. That is how I spoke. You don't have to ask me questions about that. You may want to ask me questions about Libya or Tunisia and Egypt, and I'd be happy to answer those when I can.
Right. So would you please, when you hold up your hand, we'll make sure a microphone comes to you, give your name, and then give the question, and we'll listen with great interest to Yasir's answers. First question on the right-hand side.
Thank you. Michael Munnick with the Alwaleed Centre here in Edinburgh. I wanted to ask about your last point about Islamists, and you mentioned that the term may be too blunt and too broad now to describe what we're realizing in our stunned Western fashion is a spectrum of political perspectives. But I'm wondering about what language will replace what has been a very convenient kind of catch-all term. When I read about this, you tend to start getting, analysts will make finer points which are often very, value-laden in, describing what you can't look too far before you get a sense of good Islamists and bad Islamists, and what they really mean by that is good for us or bad for us. Given that you want to have a more nativist perspective on our analysis of the region, what language would you use to describe the spectrum of political perspectives that nonetheless have a religious dimension to them?
Just to say that the language that will emerge will defy that kind of broad, coercive lumping up together of all these different parties. To give you an example from Egypt, the Sufi party in Egypt is refusing to go Islamist party. It's refusing to go into an alliance with the Hurriya and Adala, Justice and Freedom Party established by the Muslim Brotherhood and with the Salafis. There are 3 or 4 different Salafi parties. Now what language will emerge, I'm not really sure. What we have to do is, even if we use cover terms of that kind, we always need to inject into them health warnings to say this is just a label, a way of trying to paint a very, very broad picture, but this picture is somehow defeated by its very breadth. I think we will see programs develop, and I think the programs that will develop will then start to vary amongst each other in terms of whether they are going to be ideologically driven programs in terms of getting to an Islamist kind of shape and form, or programs that are more towards other ideologies, like development, like building up, countries. I don't really think that the tragedy actually is that we coin these terms, and then the Arab world gets them, and then translates them, and then the Arab world finds itself somehow arguing about its own phenomena and nativist traditions using categories that have a root outside the Arab world. So Islamiyun is an Islamist. It's always struck me as, why is it that we don't have Christianists and we don't have Judaists? I mean, Israel can have many Judaist parties if you want. There are extremely fundamentalist parties in that country, but nobody calls them as Judaists. They are right-wing or left-wing and left of center and right of center and all of that. So I'm not really sure what language will emerge, but I think what we need to do is to ensure that there isn't a very blunt lexical exchange mechanism and conceptual exchange mechanism that sort of flattens the terrain and blinds us to the amazing variety that is emerging and will emerge.
Next question. Centre here. I'll come to that one over there in a minute.
Hello, my name's Nick Holdstock. I'm a freelance journalist. I have a question about the relative importance of nationalism as a force to motivate people in the different countries, and how you see that affecting, the future.
Well, are you asking about pan-nationalism or state-based nationalisms?
State-based nationalism.
Right. Okay. I think they're there. They haven't started to emerge. Let me tell you how I noticed, when I was in Egypt last week, one of the things that struck me was how beneath the surface there is that state nationalism. Now, when I go to the Arab world and people say to ask me, where do you come from? And I say in Arabic, أنا من الوطن العربي, not from the Arab world, from the Arab lands, homelands. And that confuses them because they just don't know how to cope with it. Yeah. But anyway, so this taxi driver started to talk about the changes that he had noticed over the last few months, that the police are less coercive, they have more freedom, the police are more respectful, there's greater dignity. And then I thought, well, let me just join in. So I said to him, yes, I've noticed that. When I came into the airport, I was treated more politely, there wasn't that sort of intimidating kind of police presence. And then suddenly he snapped back and he said, do you think that Egypt was the only country in which that presence was, Every other country, Arab country had them, So all you need to do is just to scratch beneath the surface to find that these are there. But they're not making themselves loudly clear at this stage. There will be variations, of course there will be. We know, for example, that the internal composition of Syria is different. Take that as a case. The Syrians have said that we are the secularist, pan-Arab nationalists. If you want to protect all these minorities, you've got to stay with us. And that has been the nationalist narrative there. That nationalist narrative is being challenged with alternative narratives that say that minorities will be protected under a different order. So there will be emerging nationalist narratives, but there will be, of course, state-based nationalist narratives. And sometimes regional nationalist narratives, as in Syria, because that affects Lebanon and affects the Palestinian situation and Jordan to some extent.
Yes, the lady in this, just close to that. Yes.
Catherine Smith, Professor and President. My point is similar to the first one in some ways, but also goes back to your initial words when you started off your talk, in which you say that while the West, which you tell us is the USA, which I'm quite happy to accept, attributes everything to economics, the underlying issue is this question of dignity, etc. Now, if we go back into history, we do have a phrase which was very prominent, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And if we go back further into the time of the Christian Reformations in Europe, we found that we definitely did have two parties, one of which perhaps we could consider as the equivalent of the Islamists, those people who wished to return to the authority of Rome. And those were considered as definitely very, very dangerous people at that time in Europe. Now, there are two issues that I wish to put to you here. The first is whether we actually do have agreement of meaning amongst Arabs themselves of what is meant by dignity, any more than we had agreement in France in 1792 about what we meant by liberté, égalité, fraternité, because ultimately from the terror we realized that it meant liberty for those of the new regime, not for the old. Equality for those of the new regime to grab everything, not for the old to retain it. And indeed, the putting down of women. Now, economics may be important in a very fundamental way to this question of dignity, because if we look at Northern Ireland, where we have had a very violent struggle, which appeared to be sectarian, it seems in retrospect to have come down to an insufficiency of that human activity called respectable work, from which most human beings gain their feeling of personal respect and human dignity. Is this in any way informing what we are seeing in this Arab Spring? And is economics more important, perhaps, in understanding what dignity means than you are allowing?
Is there a historic continuity in this event, the series of events? That's the basis of the question.
Well, I think you're right to point one thing out to me in a kind of gentle way, that I have not given enough attention and space to economics. And that is absolutely right. I think economics is very important. And I haven't attended to it in my talk simply because it is always offered in the talks that I have been to and what I've listened to as always the frontline concept. And I'm saying, if you listen to the nativist narrations, at first sort of surface level, there are other concepts that are being used. And what we need to do now is to start to ask this question: what is meant by dignity? Does dignity have one meaning? I doubt it. Will it coalesce around one meaning that will become invariable along a diachronic line? I doubt it. Is it something which is sort of unitary? I doubt that too. I think, let me just tell you what I think personally dignity is, to some extent. Not, of course, the dignity of having not equal, but have an equal access to opportunities. But let me give you about dignities that I sometimes feel. I've lived most of my life in Scotland and in Britain. Now, I always test dignity when I go to an Arab country at the border, when I come to the police, to the immigration kiosk. It is there that I am confused, because I know that at that point, all the dignity I think I have can be taken away from me in no time by an ordinary soldier or policeman who decides for whatever reason to make things difficult for me. And that actually does happen quite a bit. I hope that, I mean, this is not a conversation, Edinburgh conversation sort of kind of meeting, but I'm going to say this because I have no plans to travel to Syria for a long time. In 1997, when I was in Edinburgh, I was invited to give a series of lectures at Homs. And when I got to Syria, carrying my British passport, I was asked not to stand in the foreigners' queue, ajanib, but to stand in the Arabs' queue, because although I carry a foreign passport, I am still an Arab. I haven't lost that side of things. Now, I was then told very quickly that I was needed, that my name appears on the intelligence register. My passport was taken away from me, although the British Council head was there, and I was asked to go and report to the intelligence services in Damascus the following day. I went to the British Council, and to my great pleasure and delight, I met my Israeli friend, Yuri Davis. Now, when I was sent to the intelligence services, I was sent to a Palestinian intelligence services, and then I was taken into this dark, dingy place, asked to write down my life story, and then I was taken to see this officer, intelligence security officer, who was going to interview me, or interrogate me. He looked, I walked in, he had a pile of files on his desk, one was open, he looked at it, looked at me, and he said, "It is not you." I said, "Alhamdulillah, thank God, and it's not me. I'm very pleased." Now, just tell you about dignity. And then he said to me, "Since you are here, let's interrogate you." And I spent 8 hours being interrogated. And my son, who was one of my sons, who was 5 years at the time, now has a file in the Syrian intelligence services. And my other son also now has a file in the Syrian intelligence services. To me, at the most basic level, this is where my dignity as a citizen has been completely trampled upon. I can give you example after example. The dignity of not being attacked, spat on by the police, the dignity of knowing that you have rights, of course you have duties. Those are the frontline dignities that people want at this stage. Of course, they want other dignities. But I think that these are the frontline dignities that people do want. And these are the ones that I think would matter to people at this stage. I think a different nativist narration of the Arab Spring in a year's time, 2 years' time, would be very different from what I've spoken about today.
Right. Question here and then a question at that side.
My name is Carol Alwaleed. I'm married to an Iraqi doctor. I think I met.
Of course we met, yes.
Yes, I think so. One thing that's quite important that I feel is the elephant in the room really is that the power of the United States of America over all these Arab puppet regimes that are now falling, and suddenly as Cameron and his followers, if you want to call them, all shot into Egypt just after the fall of Mubarak, selling them arms, and they're still at it now. What will happen? Just what will happen to the Arab Spring if they attack Iran? Because we will be in a third world war. There'll be no Arab Spring. We will really, all the world will be in serious trouble. What's your opinion on that?
Well, my goodness, this is a very difficult question. Let me just say to you that what is so remarkable is that the Iranians have, the Arab Spring has taken place next door to where the Iranians live. But until now, they have not moved, right? And there was a green revolution in Tehran in 2009. The Arabs were not moved by it either. Really, there are deep, deep antipathies between Arabs and Iranians, and we have to really take that into account. I'm not really sure what would happen. What really has emerged recently, and I know this from talking to people like my mother's and people of that kind of level, whose background, 84, the Shia-Sunni divide has emerged big time in the Arab Middle East. And there are Sunnis in Lebanon who want the failure, who want the collapse of the Syrian regime, because that will play on the internal Lebanese scene by delivering a knock, and a big knock, to Hezbollah, who are seen as Shiites, and to Iran. I'm not really sure how the Arabs would react if there were to be an attack on Iran. They will not be pleased. They will be absolutely disgusted if it was done by Israel, supported by America. But for the rest, I'm not really sure how the Iranian scene plays out in the Arabic-speaking world, and in the Arab countries. I'm not really sure. In Iraq, it would be a different thing, because there's a different constitution there. But in the rest of the Arab world, in Lebanon, it might be different. But in Egypt and the rest of the Arab world, I'm not really sure.
Some huge uncertainties there. Gentlemen on the aisle.
Anthony Cohen. Yasir, I'd like to ask you to say something specifically about Israel-Palestine.
Yeah.
You've spoken very cogently about the widespread misreading of this revolutionary movement, not least because of the undervaluing of agency. I wonder how you think, or whether you think, the Israeli government is guilty of a similar misreading. We assume that on the one hand there is highly prejudiced and wishful thinking, but on the other we've always supposed that there is a high degree of qualitative intelligence about what's going on in neighboring societies. What do you think? How do they see it?
Well, I think it's difficult to talk about Israel in one sort of way, because there are different Israels. The one that seems to be most prominent in our minds at the moment is an Israel, if one thinks about Netanyahu and people to his right, like Lieberman. They say, well, the Arab Spring has created a situation of huge unpredictability. And the Israelis don't really like unpredictability. There's a great deal of support for Bashar al-Assad in Israel. Most ordinary Israeli people, and I was there in September and in Palestine, Israel, and Jordan for 3 weeks. And I haven't seen anyone in Israel, even on the left, who wanted Bashar al-Assad to fall. And they'll tell you that Bashar al-Assad and his father delivered 40 years of tranquility on the borders. The Syrian regime is very predictable. It doesn't play a game that the Israelis will have to second guess, as it were. And ultimately, it is not in the interest of Israel for democracy to take root in the Arabic-speaking world. There are lots of reasons for it. The first one is that the kind of politics that might emerge will be different from the politics that Israel enjoyed with Mubarak and with others. That is one. Secondly, Israel has always gained a lot of credential and political capital out of saying we are the only democracy in the Middle East. An ethnic democracy, but a democracy, right? Now, to have emerging democracies will threaten, as it were, the moral claim to being the only democracy. Now, the Islamists, and I've heard that from people that I've spoken to in Egypt, if they were to come to power in Egypt, they wouldn't want to assume certain portfolios in a new government, and one of them would be foreign affairs. And I think they'll avoid the Ministry of Finance, they'll avoid the Ministry of Economics and Employment, and they'll take the service ministries, because they know that Egypt has hugely important, very difficult situation, and that they don't want to get the blame for it. But the Islamists wouldn't want to be seen to be negotiating with the Israelis directly. My feeling is that Israel, and I want to say this publicly, Israel is its own worst enemy. And the Israelis have always said the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I always say the Israelis in recent decades have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They have become very good Palestinians in a very curious kind of way. So I think what we have a dead two-state solution. We have an escalating problem, Israel-Palestine. The Egyptians, whether Islamists or not, want not to break the peace treaty with Israel, but they want to renegotiate parts of that treaty. The Jordanians have gone into a cold peace with Israel, and Israel will have to adjust to a new reality which really emerges not out of enmity, but out of democracy. And Israel cannot just say we have to attend to the home front. There will come a time when these countries will say we can't do this because the people will not accept it.
These are, I'm going to draw the questioning to a close now because we're moving on in time, but I want to come back, Yasir, to the starting point, just briefly, because we have moved into the interrelationships between states and the political consequences of what's happened. But when you described the upwelling of the values and the expression of the values of freedom, of dignity, of fear to some extent, of justice, and all of these things which really came to the fore when this Arab Spring took root. Clearly these have been there for a long time.
So, yeah.
And at the same time, this was a sudden change. And you explained that to some extent by saying that the ruling authorities simply thought they could always quell a revolution and the police and the army would take care of things. What was it which really brought these values to the point where the people in huge numbers rebelled?
Well, I think an awareness of a more globalized world in which countries that stood for values that resonated with autocratic Arab rulers had been removed off the political map. It's quite curious that Russia is getting back. I thought this is really interesting that Putin goes back to become president after having served as and even if you've seen pictures of when they met, it reminded me very much of they all clapped and it's almost like a Soviet style kind of gathering. But I think the fact that we are living in a globalized world where there are ideas with great strength, and at the same time, I think there was a realization that these regimes have ceased to be 2 terms off and that's it. They have become dynastic setups. So Hafez al-Assad goes, the president has to be 40 years old. Now, Bashar al-Assad was 34. What do? We change the constitution so that Bashar al-Assad assumes the presidency. Jamal Mubarak is to replace Hosni Mubarak. And Saif al-Islam, it's quite interesting that his opponents don't call him Saif al-Islam, which is the sword of Islam, but Zaif al-Islam. Zaif in Arabic means, the fabrication of Islam. He was going to become, so there was this prospect of rulers sort of genetically recreating themselves ad infinitum. And I think people just said, enough is enough.
Right.
Of course, economics and politics and all of this are important. Yeah. But those were, I think, some of the things that I would sort of point to at this stage.
Well, I'm going to now invite one of our fellows, Professor Carol Hillenbrand, to propose a vote of thanks. She is a close colleague and friend of Yasir, so please come and speak.
Well, I won't delay very much with this vote of thanks because we've all expressed our gratitude and appreciation in the way that we've responded to this absolutely excellent talk and to the very passionate way in which Yasir has answered the questions, very varied questions, and with great authority and inside knowledge. It reminds me, and I'd like to remind you all, what a great treasure we had in having him in Edinburgh for 17 years, where he put Islamic and Middle Eastern studies on the map, big time. And I think we'll all go away with a clear memory of these 9 themes, which were very helpful, I found. the way in which we weren't worrying about which country was being talked about, we weren't bogged down in detail and volatility and uncertainty about what's going to happen tomorrow or even this evening, where things can change. So I think the message we've got is really clearly that this is a bottom-up and not top-down set of uprisings, and that we in the West have to understand and rethink our attitudes to the Arab world. They need us and we need them. And I think Yasir's passionate response to these issues has been very memorable. So would you like to join me in thanking him very much?